Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Poltergeist. When you think of a remake of any classic film, and particularly a classic horror film, it's really an uphill battle because everyone's grown up with a certain film and watched it around Halloween for years and years and years. And it's really hard to be more than a lesser than movie in most people's eyes. But the particular problem with remaking the late 70s, early 80s horror boom is that when you think of most of those films, the star of the film was really the director. It wasn't really the actor or sometimes the monster, but most of the time when you think of those films, the real star of that film ended up being the director. When you think of John Carpenter or George Romero or Sean S. Cunningham or Tobe Hooper, they were people who became big because of how good their direction was at a horror film, how different of a horror film it was. And this film has an even bigger mountain to climb in that this film was debatably directed by Steven Spielberg, possibly. It was definitely probably one of the more hands-on producing jobs he ever did. And Poltergeist, the original, is very well known for its great direction. Whether it was Tobe Hooper or Steven Spielberg, nobody really knows, and we could debate that all day. But the point is, the direction of the original Poltergeist is frankly amazing. And so getting a director who has either been in director jail or is an interesting director only in theory, or is just kind of some studio hack to direct a remake of a film that's mostly big because of its great direction is missing the point of the brand recognition you're actually going after. The reason they were such a big deal is because they were different from a regular hack studio horror film, and then your remake answer to it is a hack studio horror film. And this film, which is directed by Gil Kenan, who is kind of in director's jail from making City of Ember a couple years ago, and that was quite a big flop. He also directed Monster House, and it might sound like kind of an inspired choice, but it really just comes off as a little better than average kind of hack studio director kind of job. It feels like an assignment picture by somebody who really isn't an auteur at all. And that's kind of the problem with all of these remakes, is because it's never really going to be better than the original because it's not even attempting to. It's like a studio's kind of like, well, people will see it, people will recognize the name, maybe check it out on Netflix or on demand, and you get a remake like the remakes we've had before and the Poltergeist remake. A family who is relocating after their dad has lost his job and they're in kind of a lot of debt, but they need to downsize and live in a smaller home, and they find a house that is under foreclosure, and so they move there even though they're not in the best financial shape, so he can hopefully find a new job and such. And the house is kind of crappier, and they're living there for a little bit. They have 3 kids, a teenage daughter, a son who's scared of everything, and of course a little girl, because this is the Poltergeist remake. So he's scared the first night living in there. They seem to want him to live in the attic for reasons that make like absolutely no sense, but it works well for the horror movie, so just go with it. He gets scared his first night when he hears something in his crawl space that's near his bed, and he opens it up and a bunch of toy clowns come out, which is like one of the most obvious horror movie cliches you could possibly do. They go for it because why not? It's the Poltergeist remake. He eventually sleeps in his parents' bed, and then that night he wakes up when he sees lots of the screens of the iPads and the phones in the house are lit up, and he walks downstairs and he sees his sister next to the TV saying, "We're here," in front of the whole family, because again, it's the Poltergeist remake. But then when the parents go to a dinner party and leave the kids alone and the teenage girl in charge babysitting, they go to this house and they find out that the community they're living in was built on a former graveyard where the grave sites were all moved to a nicer location and the house was put there instead, and their realtor had failed to mention this. But while that is being explained to them, all sorts of crazy things are going on at home. The boy is attacked by the tree, the teenage girl is attacked by kind of like these muddy people coming up in their garage, and their young daughter is transported from a portal into the spirit world. And when they come home, they can't find her, but they can hear her through the TV. And then they get paranormal investigators to come and hopefully get her daughter out from the demon world and hopefully stop this poltergeist from haunting them. One of the biggest problems with this movie, it doesn't really try to build suspense. It doesn't try to build that creepiness that you need to make a successful horror movie. You need that mood, you need that ambiance, you need it to build. And so that when something does happen, you'll jump. You can do a jump scare. When something does happen, you're primed and ready for it. This movie didn't have a jump scare. That's like horror movie 101. That's like how you set them up. That's like a basic warm-up idea. And this movie doesn't do it. It kind of just goes big and doesn't really care about building ambiance and building a scary atmosphere. If you think of something something like the first Paranormal Activity movie, that's a movie that just builds a lot of creepy ambiance. There's like a ton of creepiness in that movie, and it keeps building, and then when a door shuts, you're scared because they built it precisely well. They know that like if they keep this mood going throughout it, it'll scare you, and you're primed and ready for it. Poltergeist doesn't do that. It cares more about doing these big scares than it does about doing little scary things and building a spooky atmosphere. It just goes for it. That doesn't actually work for a scary movie. A horror movie and you're not scary, that's kind of a major problem. And with a big screen studio major remake of Poltergeist that's not scary, when something like that isn't scary, I don't really think it's doing its job. In a way, a horror movie is a lot like having sex. You have to have foreplay, you have to kind of get into it. You kind of just can't come in and just explode all over the place. You're not going to be very good, and no one's going to probably want to have sex with you after that. And horror movies are kind of the same way. Like if you just have your big stuff right away and just like blah, here it is, it's not as interesting and suspenseful. There's no fun in that, really. I didn't expect a shot-by-shot remake of Poltergeist, but in the original Poltergeist, there was that feeling, that spooky feeling, and I remember that feeling as a kid. It wasn't that I was easily scared, it was that that movie really had a creepy sense to it. And this movie just didn't really have that. You weren't ready to be scared. It was a major disappointment. It can't just do some of the simplest things that a mainstream studio horror movie should do. It kind of shows how bad of a horror movie it really is, that it can't just successfully just set up ambiance to scare you later. It just kind of expects you to be scared. It's like the reverse. It expects that kid to be scared when he's watching Poltergeist, instead of the original Poltergeist that knew it had to scare you. This just expects you to be scared, which is a major problem. One of the things that really works about the Poltergeist remake is actually the cast, especially the parents of Sam Rockwell and Rosemary DeWitt. I think they make a great couple in this movie. They have great charisma, and the family as a whole has great charisma. They feel like a real family, and I was kind of surprised how good the acting was at the beginning. It really made me empathize with the characters and be interested in what happens to this family, particularly Sam Rockwell, which I kind of think it's sad that he's doing stuff like the Poltergeist remake at this phase in his career. I wish he was getting better roles at this point, but he makes the most of it, and definitely I think does a really great job as the dad in the Poltergeist remake. He feels like the dad who says stuff like, hey bud and pal. But there's certain things about the script that don't really work for their characters. The whole thing about the family not having a lot of money, and there's a whole credit card scene with Sam Rockwell when he's trying to buy a squirrel trap, doesn't really feed into anything. With Craig T. Nelson and his job in the original, he's a real estate developer, and he helped develop the community that's there, and he didn't know that they moved the headstones and not the bodies. And so it kind of made sense that they were haunting his house, because like he was the only one responsible, I believe, who was living there. So like you kind of were like, oh yeah, of course they're gonna haunt that house, that makes sense. And in this, it's like, oh, they just haunted this random house. Oh, this random house, that's funny. They just haunted this house for like really no reason whatsoever. They just like kind of picked it out of a lineup and went, oh, we'll just haunt this house, I guess. Didn't really make any sense. Like, was there some reason for it? Was this like where most of the bodies were buried still? They don't really explain it whatsoever. I think that's kind of the fault of the script. Like, there's a lot of things, like particularly about how they don't have any money, that doesn't go anywhere. It makes you empathize with Sam Rockwell. It definitely makes you feel for him, but that's about all it's doing. It kind of makes you wonder why they had it in there as much as they did. And particularly in the dinner party where they bring up how the graves were moved. It's such a cliche at this point, it seemed a little bizarre. That scene didn't really play very well. There's a lot of scenes like that, particularly the "we're here" moment where she's just kind of saying it, and it's supposed to be creepy for 2015, but it just felt really stupid. The way they changed it didn't really work. There are a lot of 2015 things, particularly how they use technology. They have a drone at one point, those little flying drones that people can buy at the store. They use iPhones and iPads and stuff, and they really tried to make it look like a modern family. Was like a little too over the top in terms of pushing the 2015-ness. This movie was a little odd because like it's in 3D. I actually did see it in 3D just because that was the easiest showtime to see it. It didn't really add anything in 3D. But why are we putting out a horror remake now? It feels like this should have come out 5 years ago, and even this having 3D that was worthless felt like 5 years ago. It doesn't really feel like a horror movie now. I feel like horror and even mainstream horror has moved on from this. It's a relic of a former remake past, but it doesn't even try to really be a really great scary movie. People have been nicer to Gil Kenan, but I just didn't really see it in his direction. I kind of knew the house pretty well. He was pretty good at doing geography in terms of his horror movie scenes, and that's better than a lot of directors nowadays. Certainly him having these characters who I was interested in and could empathize with and wanted to follow, all of their good acting kind of turned off as soon as the scary moments happened. It felt like he couldn't mix the two. It felt like somebody who like like knew the idea of a horror movie but didn't actually know how to make a horror movie, or didn't know much about horror movies. It almost feels like they were part too interested in making a Poltergeist film, but also not interested enough in making a horror movie. Almost understood the plot to Poltergeist, but didn't understand what made Poltergeist great, or makes a horror movie great in general. It felt like more of these were like action sequences than real horror set pieces, and that's a problem when you're making a horror movie. This is very much a horror genre film, like a haunted house movie. A film like this should have good direction. A good horror movie is something that's really about the direction, and the direction in this just really didn't live up to the horror finest that it's trying to add to its pedigree. So then exactly what is the point of remaking these things other than having like a quick cash grab and having it kind of reek of it? It's as forgettable as most of the modern remakes have been. It's kind of inoffensive in what it's trying to do and not exciting enough to either like or dislike. It's just going to fall into that ghost portal and be forgotten about, and we'll probably never think about it again. Years later, we'll just think about the original and someone will bring up the remake and just go, ah, whatever, and just continue on watching an awesome movie and forgetting about this forgettable crap that'll be in the bargain DVD bin in Best Buy in the back that no one even goes to anymore. So if you have seen Poltergeist and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.